The southern resident orca whale population is front and center in the fight against increased oil tanker traffic. The majestic toothed whale is a member of the oceanic dolphin family. They're also known as killer whales because as a species they will hunt and eat fish, marine mammals. They've been known to attack baleen whale calves and even sharks and adult whales. While this is true of other orca populations, it's not true of the southern resident population that migrates into the Salish Sea for a couple of months a year. This particular pod has a very limited diet. In other words, they're picky eaters. They really like chinook salmon to the exclusion of just about everything else. They don't eat harbour seals. They're not interested in sea lions like their cousins, the transient population. Nope, it's chinook they want. And chinook, unfortunately, are a salmon population in distress. The Salish Sea Marine Survival Project is examining a wide range of factors that have contributed to the decline of chinook, coho, and steelhead. Factors that include eelgrass depletion, the reduction of the volume of phytoplankton and zooplankton, algae blooms, spawning ground disruption, great blue herons, harbour seals, and sea lions who also love to dine on chinook. According to Andrew Trites, a professor at UBC's Marine Mammal Research Unit, our beloved orcas are in danger because they rarely eat other species of salmon and they won't hunt and eat harbour seals or sea lions. In other words, they're starving due to a very narrow diet. Add in the disproportionate number of males to females and the prognosis for the southern resident orcas is not good. We invited Andrew Trites to join us for a conversation that matters about what is happening with the southern resident orca whale population.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome. Thanks for joining me. We're here to talk about the southern resident orca whale population. What exactly is that? Because I'm sure that there are people going, what do you mean when you say the southern resident whale population?
Well, in British Columbia, we have three types of killer whales. One are the transient killer whales, and they were named because they were only seen flightly. They would sort of move through the coastal waters, and it turns out that they specialize in eating other marine mammals. We have another population we call the offshore killer whales, and they come into the inside waters occasionally, but they spend most of the time offshore, and they appear to specialize in eating sharks and maybe tuna. And then we have
sharks.
Yeah, and then we have the resident killer whales, and they have specialized in eating fish. They will never touch another piece of meat except for fish.
So they're picky eaters.
They're picky eaters, and we have two types of resident killer whales, or two populations. One we call the northern resident killer whales, and they go from about midway up Vancouver Island up to Alaska.
Like Campbell River North, or maybe
more
a little
outside,
further?
Well, let's say Bamfield on the outside. And they,
so they'll stay on the outside? I thought they were on the Salish Sea.
No. We've got them both.
Passage.
We've got them both. Outside and inside.
Okay.
They're going where the fish are. Some of them might be found out on La Perouse Bank or Swiftshore Bank. And then we have the southern residents. They're cousins of the northerns, but they're not kissing cousins. They have their own territory. They don't appear to get along, and their territory goes from about they're mostly in the Salish Sea in the summertime and into the fall, and they're also on the outside, well, Bamfield south, all the way down to California. So each group has got large territories. They've got various habits in terms of how they travel and who they hang out with, but their populations are doing two very different things. The northern residents are increasing. They appear to be healthy and doing fine. They number over 300. And the southern residents, the ones that go from the Salish Sea down to California, they're not doing well. In fact, they haven't done well for probably 100 years.
Why? What is happening with that population that puts their very existence in jeopardy?
Well,
and then there's a lot of people who are worried about this.
I'd say that's the billion-dollar question. We know that there are 75 whales currently in the population. They belong to 3 different pods. But when we look further back in time, going back to 1960, they've never numbered more than 100. In fact, the highest ever numbered was 98. The lowest they ever numbered was 66, and we've seen 4 periods of increases and decreases. And genetically, there's also data showing that they probably never numbered more than 100. at least for 100 years.
Well, how does that show up in genetics?
Just in terms of the genetic diversity that's there, and so you can sort of trace through maternal lineages, and you can get an estimate of what the population sizes were in the past.
So should we be looking at the southern resident whale population as an icon of how we're doing in managing the environment? Because a lot of times I feel that they are linked to that. Here's the health of the Salish Sea, because up until you telling me right now that they migrated down as far as Northern California, I thought they only resided in the Salish Sea.
No, and most people are only looking in our backyard, and they don't realize that the species you see in our backyard aren't here year-round. This is a seasonal habitat for them.
In summertime?
Primarily summertime into the fall. And it's timed with the return of salmon, primarily chinook salmon, into the Fraser River, as well as going into Puget Sound. But the Fraser is the mother lode of salmon for southern resident killer whales. And
so when we see a decline in the total number of chinook salmon, this is going to have an impact on their diet.
There's no doubt that declines can have an effect on their diet. Of course, we have to figure out, so how much fish do they need? And because you can have perhaps some years of surplus, in which case they're not limited, but in other years, lower abundance. So it's been curious because a lot of people have looked at the southern residents and they say they're like the bellwether or the canary in the coal mine for the Salish Sea. They're in trouble, our whole ecosystem is in trouble. And yet when you look at all the other species, you realize that the southern residents are an outlier. Because we have a population of humpback whales that's come back here after 100 years of being absent. They're looking great. We've got Pacific white-sided dolphins, a resident population, and they showed up about 15, 20 years ago, small numbers, and now they're here year-round. We've got healthy, stable populations of harbor seals. We've got growing populations of stellar sea lions. And so when you look at all the other marine mammals that are feeding in this ecosystem, they would go, it seemed great to me. But the southerns are not doing well, so they are the outlier. And that's been the billion-dollar question is what's wrong with them? So
you don't see them as that canary in the coal mine, then, that is a reflection on the health of the Salish Sea?
Their condition does not reflect the Salish Sea. It reflects something much bigger. Yes, the Salish Sea is an important habitat for them, but it's only for part of the year. And the biggest indication we have in terms of what's wrong with them has been from the aerial footage with drones taking pictures to look at their body shapes and condition. And comparing this declining population, southern residents, to the northern residents that are increasing, what's been seen is that the southerns are thinner on average. And so that suggests that they're not getting enough food before they get here into the Salish Sea.
And is that because they are so limited in their dietary choices?
Well, this is going to be part of it, is the diet. So it's been a real surprise. In fact, when the researchers who discovered this first put it out, it was like hard for anybody to believe. What do you mean that with all the fish we have in the ocean, why don't they eat the herring? What's wrong with pink salmon? Maybe I don't want them, but surely they're so abundant that they could be taking those. And yet repeatedly in doing observations of collecting scales off the surface of the water after killer whales have killed something, or even looking at some of the DNA in their fecal samples as they come out, or looking at stomachs of a few dead animals, chinook salmon have been the #1. So yes, they eat other species, but they have specialized in eating chinook salmon.
Do we have any idea why they are so particular about their diet?
There's theories on it, and probably the best is that the chinook of all the species of salmon are the biggest. And so you catch one and you've got a real meal in eating one. Second, it's full of lipid. And so they are up as next to sockeye salmon, the highest in terms of fat content. And when you're a marine mammal, or let's say a seabird, it's all about the fat. You cannot get enough. And getting that fat in your system means high calories and energy to keep you warm, as well as energy to swim and do everything that a normal whale should do.
So what's different between their diet and that of the northern resident whale population?
Nothing.
Except for the fact that the northern whales will eat something different, or do they only eat chinook as well?
They too specialize in chinook.
But
So
it's that they're traveling around in a different neighborhood?
their neighborhood goes from about Barkley Sound all the way up to the Alaska border.
Oh.
And so within that system, they appear to be finding fish year-round, and also particularly during the time when the fish are coming back. The other population, it would appear they don't have as much fish in their entire habitat. And so their entire habitat, a little piece of it is British Columbia, the Salish Sea, but it goes all the way down to California, to the Sacramento River.
What about the transient population? Do they have a different diet? Or are they willing to eat other mammals? Or
the transients, they hate fish. You put a fish on the table and they push it away.
So they truly are what we would consider to be a killer whale, because they will go after a larger...
Well, they want red meat. They're after marine mammals. They love seals, sea lions, harbour porpoise, dolphins. They've even been known to take grey whale calves and even a humpback whale calf. So they are the true meat lover. And their numbers are going up. And it's interesting and the reason why they're going up, it corresponds to when we protected seals and sea lions in British Columbia and in the United States starting in the early 70s.
So humans stopped killing those.
Humans stopped killing them. They started coming up. And so there was an abundant food supply. Currently in the Salish Sea, the harbour seal numbers have been stable since about 2000. So for the past 18 years, they've been stable. And it appears to be because of the transient killer whales that have come in, and they've established an ecosystem balance for the harbour seals. Sea lions are still rising. They haven't gotten on top of that yet. But our expectation is that they too will stop growing, probably because of predation from these transient killer whales.
So are the sea lions and the harbour seals competing for chinook with the southern resident whale population?
We don't know. So we know, so originally the thinking was the seals and sea lions are just getting the adult fish. And the life history strategy when the fish come back is they sort of swamp the predator. And so unlike a person that catches fish that says, I've got a freezer at home, I can just kill and fill it up, all they can fill is their stomach.
Yes.
And so we've seen mathematically that they in terms of the overall population, they can't have a huge effect, although they do have effect if you put in dams and other fish ladders where fish become vulnerable.
Because then they can keep going back to the same pool of
That's right, and the
fish
and the fish have no escape or no refuge. And so we have some situations like that pose a real problem. But what we hadn't counted on was the fact that the seals are also eating the small little fish, the smolts that come out of the rivers.
Which prevent them from becoming adults later on.
That's right. And so that came as a total surprise. And then we're still doing some of the calculations on it, but the numbers, and so it's not all the seals doing this. It's only a small subset that have specialized in doing this only in the springtime, and they show up magically as the fish are coming out. And they have to be up to a certain size. They know that they're going to be there, just like clockwork, in the way that we know when salmon are coming back each year and can start to predict it. But the numbers suggest to us that they're having, they are a significant predator.
So these are the very sea lions or seals that we have protected as human beings.
That's right. But at the same time...
But we don't know for sure whether or not the impact that they're having on the southern resident whale population is a direct line.
We don't. So the simple analysis would say, well, if you remove the seals, then all those little fish will grow up to become adults, and we're going to get many more back.
Of course, if life were that easy.
Except that the seals are really just the first in the salmon buffet lineup.
Right,
and so
a long list of predators.
There's all kinds of predators. And so I have another student who's focused on blue herons. And
because they are going to consume them as well.
Well, but nobody ever had them on the list of usual suspects.
They didn't?
They were not there. And then it was actually a First Nations biologist from the Cowichan tribe who said to my student, you ever thought of looking up there? Because he was seeing herons going back and forth from the river. Right. And fortunately, some of the fish had tags inserted in them, so we could track them. And a student went up and he scanned with a big wand, and it just went off like a Geiger counter.
There's all these tags in around the tree?
Yeah, hundreds of tags.
Oh my God.
And so all of a sudden we thought it was the seals, and now we're saying, well, maybe it's now the herons. And it's like a lot of things in science. We start off with seeing the obvious, and then as we dig deeper and someone says something to us, we start to look at the less obvious, and then we come away and scratching. I think now we've got both the herons and the seals eating more than 100% of all the fish that are produced. So something's not adding up here,
right.
And we're still working out, but we have identified now 2 major predators. But we also know that seals, while a subset eat these smolts at a very narrow window of time, most of their diet is made up of hake. And Pacific hake can be really big, and they're one of the largest predators of salmon smolts. And so if you're to remove the seals, and you may no longer see any seals feeding your little smolts, but you come back and there's still no more fish coming back, that's because these fish, there's now more of them up to eat it. So they're the 3rd species in the seafood lineup.
Or buffet, as you put it.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so things aren't necessarily linear, and it has to be looked at in a careful way and almost take an experimental approach to really tease apart what is the ultimate factor limiting salmon.
We're living in a world where people also introduce the idea that marine traffic is having an adverse effect on the southern resident whale population. What have you found?
There's a whole group of biologists, or actually acousticians, focused on sound.
Yes.
And so what we know is that the ocean is a very, very noisy place. So even in the absence of people, there's noise in the water from the sea creatures that are there. But now you add in ships and other industrialized motors, and it becomes even noisier. So we know that the noisier things become, the harder it is to hear.
Yes.
Killer whales are acoustic, but in fact, all of our mammals rely on sound to some degree. And so
to communicate,
to locate each other, to listen for, if you're a seal, listen for that killer whale that might be out there wanting to eat you.
Right.
And the noise,
same way we use our hearing.
Yeah, and so the noise will mask their ability to communicate. And
the same way traffic does downtown.
Exactly. And so the question is, do the killer whales compensate? So just like you and I, so right now I'm not yelling at you, I don't have to raise my voice, I'm not getting really close to hear what you're having to say. But yet if we were in a party situation, we'd have probably hoarse voices, we'd probably be really close to each other, we may even limit how much we're going to say to each other. Now whether that affects how much we're going to eat that night at the party is another matter, but there's no doubt that noise has an impact. The question is, does it affect their birth rates and survival rates? It is an added stress.
Is it a tipping point?
Is it a tipping point, or is it just something which the killer whale, which has become in some respects an urbanized whale, as it has adapted to living in and amongst humans, navigating around boats and nets and fishing lines. They are very much, they are the largest species of dolphin. And so it's one that maneuvers in different ways compared to the baleen whales, like a right whale or a blue whale or a gray whale.
They're intelligent and adaptive. It would seem to be able to learn how to integrate their movements around human beings and others, but they don't seem to be able to adapt their diet, especially when it comes to the southern resident whale population. What do you think is the long-term prognosis for the southern resident whale population?
So the prognosis is really bad, and it's not because they've been down this low before. They've gone up and down over this 58-year period. But when you look at, but something that the numbers hide is the numbers of males and females, also the sex ratio of the calves they've been having. And so through a series of sort of bad luck, it would appear, they've been having more male calves than females. And of course, if you're a small population of 75, having another male in the population is not a reason to celebrate. The females are the future, and they've been in short supply. So that's been one issue.
And that's divorced from the food supply.
Well, presumably, or there's been some theory that could it be something to do with contaminants that is somehow skewing it. But I think that just as we all know families that they tried for a son, but all they got was daughters. They tried for a daughter, but all they got were sons. and others that just hit the 50-50 ratio. But when you look on the bigger picture, life balances out at a 50-50 sex ratio. And so it could just simply be nothing more than just randomness.
But it's not 50-50 at the moment.
It's not for them, whereas it is for the northerns. Sure.
Does this cause you concern?
Looking long term, and the other part that concerns me a lot is the fact that they are thin. So they're not starving, even though there's a perception that they're starving. And that perception comes, for example, we have a whale right now that is very emaciated. It's J50. And she's been followed very closely now for the past 6-7 months.
She's been made the news recently.
She's been in the news everywhere.
Yeah.
And so they're doing right now sort of a last-ditch effort in hopes that maybe it's a bacterial infection. And so trying to inject her with using a dart gun. Antibiotics.
Yeah.
But it may not be a bacterial infection. There's some that maybe it's parasites, but it could also be cancer. And so
because animals do get cancer as well.
They do, but people don't seem to be aware of that. Yes, they know their dog or cat gets cancer, but we don't think of wildlife with it. And that's because if a fish has cancer, or a bird, let's say, probably 99% of the time, a predator is going to eat it because it's slowed down, it's not behaving in the same way. It now becomes
prey.
It's prey. It's the easier prey to get, so the population is culled by the predator. When you're a top predator like a killer whale, there's nothing out there to remove you, so you will essentially waste away. So for a biologist looking at a thin emaciated animal, well, the public thinks starvation.
Which we've seen with the representation of a polar bear.
That's right.
And it turned out cancer.
That's right.
Yeah.
But sometimes those images fit a different narrative to drive a different agenda. But to a biologist looking at an emaciated animal, particularly for a killer whale, because killer whales share food. And it's just inconceivable that they would decide this young female killer whale doesn't deserve to eat.
Thank you very much for coming in and sharing all this information. It was really illuminating. I didn't know most of this about our southern resident whale population.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.